The question of this segment, if you will, what we really want to discuss is how does a foreign power, how does America manage its affairs and manage its presence in the Arab Islamic world, and what are the requirements for an effective American role and effective American presence in that greater Middle East?
Many years ago, it must be at least 40 years ago, the Public Record Office, which is the British National Archives, made a decision. They said that they would publish all documents earlier than 1600. Later, by the way, they changed their minds and they didn't do it. But that doesn't affect the story. They decided to publish at that time all documents earlier than 1600.
1600, yes.
And one of the interesting files was the file of the first English embassy in Istanbul. Queen Elizabeth was persuaded by the Levant Company, which was a trading corporation, to open an embassy in Istanbul. They said, we know you don't need it, but we do. We'll pay all the expenses, we'll find the place, we'll provide the staff. All you have to do is give us your official approval. And the Queen was willing to go along with that. And English, not British at that time, English embassy was duly opened in Istanbul and continued from then right up to the present day. Now it's in Ankara, of course. I was asked to go through the documents for the first 10 years, which took it up to 1600. And now you can imagine that in the 1590s, there was not a single person in England who knew any Turkish. There was not a single person in Turkey who knew any English. All the documents had to be translated, and it was two-stage translation. So some official in the Foreign Office in London would write a letter to the Sultan in the name of the Queen. He would write the letter in English. The letter would be translated into Italian, probably by a Levantine employed by the English embassy. This would be handed to the Turks, and it would be translated from Italian into Turkish, probably by a Levantine employed by the Ottoman government. And the reply would come the same way, by the same route. All these were in the Public Record Office: the English, the Italian texts, and the Turkish texts. And I went through them, and I was fascinated by what I found. What I found was a pattern of consistent, systematic, purposeful mistranslation all the way. And it wasn't only in the 1590s. I was curious enough to follow it into later files, and it went right on through the 17th, 18th centuries. Purposeful, systematic mistranslation. Why? The translators were local people for the most part, as I said, Levantines, employed either by the British government or by the Turkish government. And they had a strong vested interest in not offending their employers, and not offending anybody, in fact. So everything was sort of toned down or modified. The Sultan would send a letter to the Queen saying, "We hope you will continue to be firm-footed in your loyalty to our world-embracing imperial throne." That would be in the Turkish, which in English would become, "We hope you will maintain the continuing good relations between our two governments," which is not exactly the same thing. This goes right on. I mean, at a later stage, London sends an instruction to the British ambassador in 18th century Istanbul to make strong representations. In translation, the strong representations become meek submission, and so on and so on and so on. This goes on all the time. This, as you can imagine, aroused my curiosity. And I looked at other things too, and I found this continues right up to the present day. For example, both the BBC and the Voice of America had systematic recordings and translations of broadcasts in Arabic from Arab countries. If you compare the ones made for the British government with the ones made for the American government, by the Arabs employed and by both, there's a systematic difference. In the British ones, anything anti-British was omitted, or weakened, anything anti-American was fully preserved. And the ones provided for the American government, anything anti-American was toned down or omitted, and anything anti-British was fully preserved, and so on. The point, as I said, was not a deliberate intention to deceive, but to keep your job, keep on good terms with the bosses, and play it safe. This continues to the present day. If you look, for example, at the collected published speeches of President Nasser of Egypt, they were published in Arabic. There's also an official publication in English. And there are quite significant differences between the Arabic and the English versions. And the same is true of almost every other kind of pronouncement that comes out of the region. And that's why I would say it is extremely important, more than important, it is absolutely vital to have people who know the languages of the region well enough to understand them when spoken and to read them when written. And it is not sufficient to employ people who originate in the region, right, because I'm not impugning their loyalty or their goodwill, but it is natural and I would say inevitable that they should, shall we say, either tone down or omit anything unpleasant that would be offensive to their employers. And the record shows this very clearly. As I say, hundreds of years of record. Now, in the early 19th century, the British government finally became aware of this problem and decided that it had to train people in Middle Eastern languages, especially Turkish, but also Persian and Arabic. And from that time onwards, they did really have people who knew the languages and who were English, not Middle Eastern. And I think this is a very important change.
See, I think this connects very nicely with what you said when you debunked the notion of an American imperium. That America really doesn't. I mean, we were forced into the Middle East, sucked into the Middle East, if you will, in this new push,
yes,
by 9/11, and we went there. This is a reluctant power in many ways. I mean, you were speaking about this view of history opened up for you by the archives. Unlike you, I haven't spent that much time in the archives. I mean, someone asked me once, said, because I think I may have told you once that there came a time when I acquired a new first name, and the first name was And, because people would say Bernard Lewis. The people who support the Iraq War are Bernard Lewis and Fouad Ajami. So I became, this And. So I haven't spent. Someone asked me, said, "What's the difference between how you work, and the great historian Bernard Lewis?" I said, "Well, I think he does more Latin than I do, and I do more vernacular than he does, and I know the streets a little better." And to go from what you said about the archives, it's been my experience, because having spent a fair amount of time between 2003, when America went into Iraq, and now, I've been in and out of Iraq, and I've watched the Americans trying to negotiate this very alien culture in which they found themselves. And of course, the question of language turns up. Here is a country that was completely into the stock market in the 1990s, pushed into Iraq. We didn't have enough people who knew Arabic. We didn't have them in the military. We didn't have them at state. We didn't have them in the Defense Department. And so, of course, you swept the people that you could. And a fair number of translators were people who were Jordanians, Palestinians, etc. I think eventually the American military took up translators who were Iraqis. But at the beginning, they were reluctant to have the Iraqis. So we ended up with a lot of these translators. And my experience with them, I'm not embarrassed to say it, they were very, very dubious about the American project in Iraq, to be kind. They opposed it. They thought what America was doing in Iraq was wrong. That didn't prevent them from going with the American forces into Iraq. And they did not have a very high opinion of the aspirations of the Iraqis. Many of them were Arab nationalists. Right. Many of them were sympathetic to the old order of Saddam and his clique. So there they were in Iraq with the Americans, translating for this new foreign power as it went about, trying to have this project of liberating Iraq. One particular translator who incurred my wrath was an Egyptian, and he had never had any kind word to say about either the Americans in Iraq or the Iraqis, which provoked me a couple of times to basically go into him and what exactly are you doing here, and what exactly do you think of what the Americans are doing? It's a very big problem. How does a great foreign power come into a world it doesn't fully know, it doesn't fully appreciate, it doesn't fully understand the language of signals and the values?
Let me add a little story to that. A friend of mine who was a professor in a Middle Eastern university was invited some years ago to go on a lecture tour in China, which he accepted with alacrity. And then he said to his Chinese host before he went there, he said, "I suppose you would want me to lecture in English." And they said, "No, you can lecture in Arabic." And he said, "Really?" He said, "Oh yes, our people will understand you." He went on a lecture tour of several Chinese universities and lectured in departments of Middle Eastern studies to Chinese audiences who followed a lecture in Arabic and asked questions in Arabic.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's something to think about.
Well, it's not an American vocation. I mean, for example, as you and I, spent years of our careers have been in the academy, and we work with young people who want to understand these places. I mean, here I am. I direct a Middle East program at Johns Hopkins, and language is a very important component of it.
Right.
My relentless message to them, my khutbah, my sermon to them every time I speak to them is I say, look, if you can't handle Arabic, how will you penetrate these societies? How will you understand them? If you don't read, if you can't understand what a certain preacher is saying, if you can't come and understand what bin Laden did in that famous fatwa that you explicated in the essay "License to Kill" some 10, 11 years ago, then how will you understand this culture?
Yeah.
Where does this American power? We decided we can't call it imperial. This great foreign power. Where does it put down anchor in that Arab Islamic world? Like, what can it rely upon? I lead you to this question by quoting something you said some years ago. You said the region is divided into three kinds of categories. You have pro-American regimes with anti-American populations. And I think you may have mentioned Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. That's not bad. You have anti-American regimes with pro-American populations. I know that you put Iran there, and maybe even perhaps Syria. I don't know.
At that time, Iraq.
Yes, and Iraq. And you were right. You were vindicated in the case of Iraq. And then you had a category which now requires some massaging, which is pro-American governments with pro-American populations, which is Israel and Turkey. We now have to revisit the question of Turkey.
Right.
So where does this great foreign power put down anchor? Who can it rely upon? What forces can it work with? Like a man we both know, Saad ad-Din Ibrahim, the Egyptian sociologist who ran afoul of the Mubarak regime in Cairo and paid for it and was imprisoned and is now living outside Egypt. He has described the region as being claimed, he said, you have the autocrats on one side and the theocrats on the other, and very little in between.
Yeah.
So where does this foreign power, where does it put down anchor? On whom can it call?
It's certainly a very difficult situation, and there's no clear or obvious answer about it. I would just say this, that in the short term, it's very, very difficult and gloomy. In the long term, I would feel more optimistic, because the pattern that we see now in the Arab world, in which many people describe as sort of typical characteristic of the Arab world, is not typical and characteristic of the Arab world. It's a modern imposition. If you go back a couple of centuries and look at things before the beginning of what is variously known as modernization or westernization, it comes to the same thing. They did not have this pattern of authoritarian government on the one side and meek submission on the other. There are traditions. I will not say democratic traditions, because that has a quite specific meaning, but there are traditions of limited, responsible government.
And notions of just government. I mean,
Exactly.
I borrow this from what you've written.
Notions of just government,
right,
and notions of limited government,
yes,
and even notions of contractual government. All that is there in the region, and one sees signs of it beginning to emerge again. I mean, the progress in Iraq, considering the background, I think is quite remarkable. Wouldn't you agree?
I call it Irocracy. It's the version of
Yeah.
Iraq. I mean, I always, like, my defense of Iraq, and I want to ask you a couple of questions about Iraq. My notion of Iraq is, my defense of it, I always say, when I go to Egypt, I know I'm coming into Mubarak's country.
Yeah.
When I go to Jordan, I know I'm going into King Abdullah's country. When I go to Saudi Arabia, I know I'm coming into Dar al Saud, the lands of al Saud. And maybe it's my wish, but it's so. Perhaps when I enter Iraq, I do not believe I'm coming into Nur al-Maliki's country, or Talabani's country, or Shalabi's country, or Sistani's country. I really believe I'm coming into a very diverse and pluralist country.
Yes.
And I see all strands of Iraqi attitudes and Iraqi groups.
It was probably, it has been said that it was a mistake, and one may agree with that it may have been a mistake to hold a general election at such an early stage. But nevertheless, the general election was a remarkable success.
Right.
That the Iraqis were willing to participate, risking their lives to do so.
Look, Iraq is, I mean, let's take a look at Iraq. It has a Kurdish president.
Yeah.
Then he has two vice presidents. One is a Sunni Arab, the other one is a Shia. It has a Shia prime minister.
Yeah.
He has a deputy prime minister who's a Kurd.
Right.
The commander, the chief of staff of the armed forces is a Kurd. And this is my favorite, the foreign minister is a Kurd.
Yeah.
And therefore, when the Arab League has a conference of foreign ministers, it now has to confront the diversity of
Right.
Iraq. That someone is in a room, Hoshiar Zibari, who is not an Arab, he's a Kurd.
Right. Well, praise of diversity is an
Yes.
old tradition. اختلاف أمتي رحمة.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think there is, it's a kind of it's an indisputable fact. If you take a look at the discourse of the new American administration, the Obama administration, there has been a reluctance to embrace Iraq.
Yeah.
Because Iraq is seen as the project of George W. Bush.
Yeah.
This is the neoconservative baby. But yet, Iraq is a place where an anchor could be put
Exactly.
down, if you will.
I mean, to reject Iraq and embrace Afghanistan seems
Yes.
to me is
So the question is where America puts down anchor is a very interesting one. Maybe it would be worth a word or two about these regimes. Is the American investment in Egypt wise and sustainable? I mean, how do you see the Egyptian regime of Hosni Mubarak?
Well, I see a lot of difficulties. On the other hand, I find it difficult to come up with an alternative.
Yes, there is no alternative to the.
This is the problem.
So in a way, it's like what's called al-badil al-mukhif in Arabic, the frightening alternative.
Yeah.
So it's either the Egyptian state or what? The Muslim
Or
Brotherhood.
the Muslim Brothers or something like
I
that.
mean, is this
yes.
where we are in a proud country like Egypt, which had a vibrant, democratic, we agree, not so much,
Yeah. Well, obviously, the government of Egypt has an interest in presenting it in those terms.
Exactly.
In the last election, for example, clearly the message which they wanted to get across is it's either us or the Muslim Brothers.
Right. And that takes us to what Saad Ibrahim said, it's the autocrats and the theocrats.
Yes. Right.
And nothing grows in the middle.
Yeah.
So we've had, I think, well over 3 decades of an American presence and an American investment in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Would we say it's been a brilliant investment or just defensible?
Defensible with difficulty.
Defensible investment.
Barely.
Barely defensible investment. And the regime in Egypt, that's my sense of them is they peddle a combination of a kind of anti-modernism and anti-Americanism, and they offer it as a kind of steady diet to the populace, and it works reasonably well for the regime's purposes.
Yeah, but the Muslim Brotherhood is still very strong in Egypt.
Right. And there is, of course, the discussion in Egypt. I mean, here's Egypt. It had, during the Wafd years, this long parliamentary and liberal tradition by many lights. And now it faces the prospect of succession by Mubarak's son. Is that
Right.
do you see that as one possible future for Egypt?
This is what happened in Syria, and this is what would have happened in Iraq if we'd had them.
Yes.
The tendency to hereditary, which means royal dynasties.
Royal dynasties.
Yeah.
And that for Egypt, is that, my reading of it is this would be a very big step for the Egyptians I mean, think of it this way. You know, the great Jamal Abdel Nasser died and his family had no role to play in politics.
Yeah.
They were just simply, they took their bow and that was about it. And Sadat from 1970 to 81, again, now you have a different situation.
Well, I mean, both Nasser and Sadat appointed deputies,
Right,
which means in effect nominated successors.
yes.
Mubarak, in all the years that he's ruled Egypt, has never nominated a vice president.
Well, The Economist recently, in a very clever turn of phrase, said, imagine Rip Abu Winkle, not Rip Van Winkle, but Rip Abu Winkle, who went to sleep in the 80s.
Yeah.
He wakes up today and he looks at the Arab world and look what he sees. When he went to sleep, Mubarak was president. Mubarak is still president. When he went to sleep, Gaddafi was president. You know, by the way, Gaddafi is the dean of Arab rulers. He's been there now for 40 years.
Yeah.
This is the 40th, you know. And then he looks around and he finds that Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen is president, etc., etc. He will miss Hafiz Assad, but he shouldn't be chagrined. There is his son. So,
Yeah.
were I to write a book about Arab politics, my little pun on it is to say, I would use the title of Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises. So the suns have risen, the dynastic element has crept
Yeah.
into the Republican regimes, and I think the question still is there.
Yeah.
Where does Pax Americana, where does this foreign power, where does it put down anchor, and
Yeah.
with whom does it work?
Well, the dynastic element is, of course, traditional in the region, but very different from the European monarchies. I mean, in European monarchies, the rule is primogeniture, that is, the eldest son.
Right.
In the Islamic monarchies, in the Ottomans and the Abbasids and all the others in between, the ruler chooses,
Yes.
nominates a successor designate,
Yes.
who doesn't have to be his son. It may be his brother or his cousin or his nephew. They're usually from the same extended family, but it's not sort of necessarily father to son, and that's not necessarily a bad system.
No. It's actually rises in another very important Arab country for the world economy and for us all, which is a very interesting country for me because I'm studying it and trying to write about it, which is, of course, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Because now the question in Saudi Arabia is, we are into the 5th year of the 4 or 5 years after the rise of King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia. And there is a situation in Saudi Arabia where his designated successor, his half-brother Sultan, is ailing. And so the royal sweepstakes, if you will, in Arabia became who would be the third man in the line of succession. Or should there be a third man? There was a talk about an allegiance council. There was a talk about a way of choosing someone in this line of succession. And King Abdullah preempted all this by designating Interior Minister Naif as the second deputy prime minister. Everybody understood what that meant, that now it's Abdullah and it's Sultan, and then third in line of succession is Naif, the Minister of Interior. I can assure you the grief among liberals, modernists, bloggers, etc. in Saudi Arabia is considerable because they view the Interior Minister as, shall we say, not quite a friend of reform. Not quite a friend of reform. He is very close to the so-called hayat, to the committees for the propagation of virtue and the prevention of vice, which are very important in the country. And they look at Naif and they despair. There was supposed to be a film festival in Jeddah, because Jeddah is the more worldly city of the realm. And Prince Naif just simply put an end to that. So there is a discussion in Saudi Arabia now about what exactly is the future of this realm. If Abdullah, the reformer, if you will, hands over not so much to Sultan, who is, as we said, is quite ailing, perhaps fatally so, and then there is Naif standing in the wings, and the hopes of reform are very much in contention, and they're invested in this among this narrow circle of brothers. In the Bernard Lewis tradition, there's always the illuminating anecdote, which tells the large story. I read this item. It was a kind of indication that we've begun to master the ways of the region slightly. It's about that the CIA has discovered a way of courting the Afghan warlords. Because as you know, we're trying to have a campaign for Muslim hearts and minds. So I read this item in the Washington Post that the CIA has decided that one way of courting the Afghan warlords is to supply them with Viagra. And that this is, and the item was very telling. He said, we had this one warlord, we wanted to operate in his district, he was not very friendly. We gave him a whole supply of Viagra. He came up the next morning, big smile on his face. After that, we've been able to do whatever we wanted to do in his district. So in fact, we're now beginning to learn the ways of the region. And it has taken us a while. It has taken us a while. I mean, I believe in this kind of American ingenuity that Americans eventually will, they will try many things and they will get it right. So we're trying to find our way through the Medina and its alleyways. And it's a very, very big challenge.
Yeah. My first acquaintance with Americans came during World War II, when I was part of His Majesty's forces. And at a certain stage, some members of the American force were attached to our department as liaison officers. This was my first contact with Americans of any kind. I'd never been to America. I'd seen films, of course.
So you must have been like, what, 26, 27, something like this.
I'd seen, my only acquaintance with America was from books and the cinema.
Yes.
And this was my first acquaintance, and it was a very interesting experience meeting these young Americans. And we worked together for quite a while, liaison between our department and our American opposite numbers. And there were two things that struck me. The first one was that they were unteachable. We had been at war for some time. We had learned a number of hard lessons the hard way. We had paid a heavy cost in blood and toil and money. And we wanted to save our new allies from having to pay the same cost. But no, they wouldn't listen. They said, you do things your way, we do things our way. And they insisted and went on and made the same mistakes that we'd made. The second thing, which was very impressive, was the speed with which they realized the mistakes,
Right.
saw them, understood them, devised and applied remedial action.
That's exactly. I mean, I think of our legendary, now amazing commander in Iraq, David Petraeus. I mean, when David Petraeus turned the American war around in Iraq, I mean, he was to this war what Matt Ridgway was to the American war in Korea. When he began to understand exactly how you repair this project. And he described it as trying to repair a plane in mid-flight while you're being fired upon.
Yes.
And he did it very well.
Right.
Do you have any second thoughts? I mean, I'm sure you're asked this question about your support for the American war in Iraq. Do you have buyer's remorse?
My support for the American war in Iraq is not exactly as portrayed.
Right.
It was something different. You will remember that in Iraq, the northern zone was not under Saddam Hussein's rule. Right. It was in effect independent,
Sure.
ruled by an alliance of Kurds and Arabs. On two occasions, the leaders of the northern zone put forward a proposal to establish in Iraq a provisional government of free Iraq. Now, a provisional government of free Iraq declared in New York or Washington would be meaningless, but one on Iraqi soil would have really meant something. They told us that they had promises of support from a number of generals in the rest of Iraq, in Saddam Hussein's territory. And I have no doubt that and they did not ask for any military help. All they asked for was a strong statement of support. They never got it. The first request was during the Clinton administration. The second request was at the beginning of the Bush administration. Now, I really believe that if we had responded to that, it would have been possible to win the Iraqi campaign right away in the whole of Iraq without a war. That was what I favored doing.
Right. See, I'm unrepentant. I think this was a noble war.
Oh, yes.
And I think that what has been created in Iraq is something that Americans over the next 10 years or so can look back and be reasonably proud of.
I agree with you, yes.
I think to be able to install something of a democracy or Iraqracy in this very arid zone for democratic politics.
Right.
And to change, to turn over a government. You were right when you said that Iraq would have chosen the route of dynastic succession.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that after Saddam, his odious son Qusay was going to inherit, and maybe even his grandson, who was killed in Mosul with the two brothers Uday and Qusay, would have also. This would have been a reign of 1,000 years, this Takriti reign of terror. And so I think that as far as the war in Iraq, with all the mistakes, with all the wrong turns we took, one can look at Iraq and be reasonably proud of it. And there is a rap against Iraq, which I'd be keen to know what you think of it, is that we have created a kind of a sister republic, if you will, a sister Shia republic of the Iranian theocracy, which I think is a slur on Iraq.
Yes, I agree.
You know, I don't think the Shia. I mean, you've written extensively about the Shia in history and the Shia Arabs. Is this a clone of the Iranian regime
No,
that
it's
we
not.
have?
Of course not. I mean, since I'm not a Muslim, I can take a neutral position as between Sunni and Shia.
Right. Well, I mean, since I invested this effort and this curiosity in what's going on in Iraq, and I think I may have been, though we go back to identity. You said people can have multiple identities.
Right.
I actually went to Najaf and had the privilege of meeting Grand Ayatollah Sistani, and I suppose I did it in my identity as a Shia, because he had not been willing to allow Americans to come and see him. And so when I went to see him, the question was, would Grand Ayatollah Sistani allow me to see him? And I suppose he could look at one part of my identity, that I came from Jabal Amal, I came from a Shia family in Lebanon, and therefore he would see me. And indeed, it was an amazing moment. I mean, to just see this incredible personality. And I think that the idea that the Iraqi Shia are tributaries of Iran is a complete travesty, a complete misrepresentation of their history.
I think that's nonsense.
Yeah.
They tried to use this against Chalabi.
Right. And I think they've used it very, very brutally and very effectively against him. But Chalabi is a man with tremendous political skills, and I think he will. We will hear from him.
You think he has a future?
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, look, Iraq has allowed a multiplicity of voices and a multiplicity of people.
Right.